Hey, everybody, I'm Nick Knudsen with Stand Up and Holler. Wanted to put a brief message at the front of this episode, letting you know that we had some issues with the video file, having some technical difficulties, but we did record an episode this week and we do want to get it out. We will be having some words with the game changer coordinator for our video files. We'll look into that. We'll get this resolved for next week, but we'll be back next week after the Missouri game as well. But we wanted to put this episode out just more in a podcast format. Enjoy the episode and go Gators. I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler on tonight's episode. We got LSU scoring the football, LSU scoring again, and maybe LSU scoring one more time. But hey, you know, we played a tough game. We were in it in the second half. But we'll get the Missouri preview at the end before we get out of here. But we're just at the point in the season, Will, where you can't be surprised by the defense anymore, right? That's the level of outrage in terms of the poor defensive performance is understood because we were at 700 yards of offense given up by LSU. I'm not sure that's always conveyed coming out of Gainesville. That's a completely frustrating statistic for most people witnessing what's going on here. We handed Jaden Daniels the Heisman on Saturday night. Jaden Daniels, 372 yards through the air, 3 touchdowns, and 234 on the ground. All right, 2 touchdowns on the ground, 3 touchdowns through the air. That's a Heisman Trophy performance right there. I think the college football media is loving this because there really hasn't been anyone that's jumped out to be the true front runner. And this performance, we'll be watching a lot of these highlights for the rest of the season. That second week in December, you can count on seeing more of the highlights from this game. But, Will, aside from the atrocious defense, which we can talk about, the offense kept you in the game, and it doesn't feel like it. But if you go back and look, I promise you check it's there. 9 minutes left in the game. This is a 3-point game. This is a 3-point game at Death Valley with an LSU team that's got a killer offense, and your offense is keeping you in the hunt. You never really felt like at any point that Florida was truly the dominant team on the field. It felt more lucky to be in it at times with the way LSU was moving the ball. Florida was more methodical, but the Gators were in it and fighting late in the game. So despite the horrific performance on defense, that might be the silver lining, that they're still in the game, they're still fighting, and there was a chance down the road. On the other hand, you did give up 52 points and you lost. Like I said last week, 36 points should win you a lot of games in the SEC. 35 should win you a lot of games in the SEC.
Yeah, the offense hasn't really been a problem. Other than the Georgia game, they've been up over 35 points pretty much every game since Vanderbilt. And, you know, they've been up over 30 points in the 4 games other than Georgia and are 2-2. And that's really where I think you start to pick apart some of the things that are going on within the team specifically. My main criticism of the offense is a few things. One is that they just don't generate explosive plays more than 20 yards. Like their explosives tend to be 22, 23, 24 yards.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're giving up 85-yard just daggers from Jaden Daniels all over the field, it's going to feel like the field's tilted. And that's what it felt like. It felt like the field was tilted all night. Now, LSU made a bunch of mistakes, and there's a reason why LSU's got 3 losses. And part of that is because their defense is just as bad as Florida's. And then the other part is that they dropped the kickoff, right? And turned that over and gave Florida a short field. They turned it over on 4th down on downs twice when they had the ball in Florida territory, once at the 1-yard line. And even then didn't get a punt out of Florida to put them in bad field position at that point. So I think there were some defensive stops, and people were going to give the defense credit there in the first half, but they were still lucky. They gave up 9.8 yards per attempt in the first half, which sounds terrible until you realize they wound up at 11.5 for the game, which means they gave up 15.1 yards per play in the third quarter and 12.1 in the fourth quarter. They were outgained 192-73 in the second quarter. And I think that's where maybe the criticism comes in, is that last 2 minutes of the half when Billy Napier decided to sort of just tuck and go into the halftime down 3. That's not within the purview of what this Florida team can do, given the limitations they have on the defensive side of the ball. Mm-hmm. But from an offensive perspective, I'm not upset at the way the team played. I thought Mertz was okay. I didn't think he was great. I thought I thought Etienne was really good. And I didn't think they got him the ball enough. I think Trey Wilson sort of disappeared at times. They didn't get him the ball enough. And I know Napier's going to say, well, there are times where, the defense dictates where you go with the ball, but LSU's defense shouldn't be able to dictate anything. And finally in that second half, Florida started running some power stuff and going right at LSU. And when they did, they had some success. Again, you get the call, it's overturned, which I don't understand how that's overturned. I'd like to hear the SEC's explanation for that one. On the throw to Khalil Jackson, that again, the field just felt tilted every time. And this is the thing about Florida, is that in the Utah game, when they threw the interception down the red zone, defense couldn't get a stop. In the Kentucky game, when they threw the interception, hits off Boardingham's hands, gets intercepted. Still, that one I give a little bit to Mertz, but still, you know, defense can't stop him. And then you get this one on the throw to Khalil Jackson, gets overturned. You got to punt it away. Defense can't stop him. And that sort of has been the theme for Florida all year long. The defense with Shamar James was serviceable. Without Shamar James is just awful. And we saw it. The running backs for LSU really took advantage of the linebackers for Florida. It reminded me of two things. It reminded me of the Joe Burrow game back in 2020 or 2019 when Florida couldn't stop him at all. And Trask was going toe to toe with him, made one mistake on the interception in the end zone. And because Florida's defense couldn't stop him, they were always one score behind. And that's kind of what this one felt like. Felt a little bit like the LSU game a few years ago when Anthony Richardson came in. And again, they were one score behind and just couldn't get the stop. And then the other thing it reminded me of was the SEC championship game a couple years ago against Alabama, where Alabama was always 2 scores ahead. Florida pull it to 1 score,
Right.
then they pull ahead by 2. And Najee Harris just absolutely terrorized Florida's linebackers, and that's kind of what that reminded me of as well. So I'm citing games where Florida's defense was not good at all as the comps, and I think that's sort of what we get out of this one is the linebacker play had stuff to be desired. I think everybody's play had things to be desired, and you just sort of smile and say, LSU's a better team this year. We didn't really expect to beat LSU coming into this season. They were one of the few teams left on the schedule though that had a glaring weakness on the defensive side of the ball. You weren't able to take advantage of that. And honestly, that's the thing about the last 2 minutes of the second half that bothered me is you didn't try to take advantage of the disadvantage or the weakness that LSU had in that particular moment. Instead, you got a little bit conservative and it cost you. Right. This wasn't a game where you could give up 3 points or 7 points when you had a possession, and Florida basically just punted on that possession in order to run out the clock. And I get it. They didn't want to give up a quick strike to Jaden Daniels, and I can understand why they didn't want to give up a quick strike to Jaden Daniels. But the issue there is that LSU's defense is just as capable of giving up a big strike as Florida's defense is, and you had to sort of take that attitude. So I was a little bit disappointed that this didn't feel like the Tennessee approach from a couple of years ago, or last year, where Napier knew that his team was limited, knew the defense was going to struggle to stop the Volunteers, knew the Volunteers had a really good offense, knew Hendon Hooker was a really good player, and then just decided to go for it on 4th down all the time, was ultra aggressive, really tried to put points on the board every time he had an opportunity. It cost him a couple of times, but a couple other times he gained from it, and Florida came up just a little bit short in that one. This one, Florida comes up a lot more short than that just because I didn't think they were aggressive enough at times.
Now, I have to harp on the defense a little bit here, Will, because the defense was the glaring issue the other night. So going back to it, I would say if you watching that game, there's just so many instances where LSU had guys completely surrounded by green. There was nothing around them. The blue jerseys, it took them a minute to get in the frame after they catch the ball. Or Jaden Daniels, how many times is he 15, 20 yards downfield? Nobody's even touched him yet. I saw several instances. You mentioned the linebacker play. We like Scooby Williams. He's a good player. It seems like he's guessing on some instances. How much of this is a product of young players trying to play through some things right now where we're seeing some mistakes, and how much of it is players aren't getting in the right position, and how much of it is the talent's just not where it needs to be quite yet? It's young, it's developing. We're not quite what we need to be at an SEC level just yet.
Well, so I mean, I think that there's two things that you can say there. One is that the staff has made a conscious choice to go young. Whether or not they completely made that choice or whether some of the upperclassmen made that choice for them, they made choices to go young. And some of the guys who've left, Antoine Powell-Ryland might be the ACC Defensive Player of the Year. Andrew Chatfield at Oregon State, I think, has 9 sacks. You got Hopper, who's at Missouri. You've got a bunch of other guys who've transferred out and have been relatively successful. And I know that Napier came in wanting to set a tone, wanting to set a culture, and maybe he needed to do that given the way the team was sort of set up. At the same time, like we all know college football, you got to make compromises, right? Dabo Swinney goes around talking about integrity. We all know that recruiting can't require integrity at all. So if he's winning the recruiting battles out there, his integrity is going out the window in certain instances. And that's not a knock on Dabo. It's just the way college football recruiting works. I think it's sort of the same thing. Like you got to make compromises. You got to have a couple of knuckleheads on your teams at times in order to sort of get the juice going. And you think about Golden State with Draymond Green, right? He brings a lot to the table, but he also takes something off of it. And you got to be willing to take that stuff that he takes off of it to get all the things that he provides onto it. And whether Napier has that attitude in terms of being able to do that and whether he was able to, given, again, we don't know everything that was going on from a culture standpoint when he came in. All that being said, they made a choice. They made a choice to go young. So now to say, well, we got young players, we need to be patient, I think is a little bit of a cop out. I think these guys are getting the reps. These are the guys you identified. These are the guys you brought in and evaluated. And these are the guys who need to perform. I think historically, it's been very difficult to perform with teams that are this young. If he had, a top 10 class and a top 3 class and they were performing poorly, I'd be like, hey, there's still hope. But these weren't, or still hope for these particular players. But they're not getting what they need to out of the 2021 class is really the problem. Guys like Jason Marshall, guys like Austin Barber, who's been okay, but hasn't necessarily been great. And I think those are the things you got to. So the 2021 class, the starters are Jason Marshall, Scooby Williams, Tyreek Sapp, Austin Barber, and Caleb Banks transfer in, right? Then you got Jake Slaughter, Desmond Watson, Marcus Burke, and Rocco Underwood. Underwood's the long snapper. Not expecting a ton from him. Banks is a starter, but hasn't really been a difference maker. Slaughter has kind of been a starter because Eglinton's been out. Desmond Watson, a backup, but again, not a difference maker. Barber is a serviceable tackle. I wouldn't say he's been a great tackle. Sapp, same thing at defensive end. Williams, you already mentioned some of the struggles he's had. He looked much, much better on the outside than he has since they've had to move him inside. And Jason Marshall just hasn't been the 5-star player that we need on the outside. So that 2021 class is 3 classes out. That's where you would expect your solid play to come from. And that's not a place where Florida has gotten, I wouldn't call any of those guys the best players on the team. And I think that's where you run into a problem is you want your upperclassmen to be the best players on the team, supplemented by younger guys, as opposed to if you look at the 2022 class where you've got Shamar James, you've got Trevor Etienne, you got Montrell Johnson as a transfer, you've got Ricky Pearsall, you got Hayden Hanson and Arliss Boardingham. Like those are the best players on the team. You got Trey Wilson and Jordan Castell for 2023. Make some arguments about Castell recently, but Trey Wilson obviously has been one of the best players on the team. So the best players on the team are from that 2022 and 2023 class. They don't have the supplementation that they need. And I actually looked back just out of curiosity at so Nick Saban had for his team, he had 9 all SEC players his second season when the team all of a sudden made a big switch and turned things around. But 6 of those all SEC players weren't recruited by Saban. And then if you go to Kirby Smart, his 2017 team that Jake Fromm took over at quarterback, that team had 6 all SEC players, and all 6 were not recruited by Kirby Smart. So those teams that turned things around in year 2 turned it around with guys who'd been recruited by the previous administration. And we certainly criticized Dan Mullen a lot for his recruiting and for the attrition. And then Billy Napier came in and sped up that attrition. And that's what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a hole in the guys who are even just serviceable from 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. And some of these guys have profiles where they should be serviceable. A guy like Jason Marshall should be more than serviceable. And we're not getting elite cornerback play out of Marshall. We're not getting elite cornerback play out of Kimber. We're not getting really I mean, we got freshman safeties out there, and we're not getting elite play from guys like Princely Human Milan. Like, he's not bad, but he's not great. Tyreek Sapp, not bad, but not great. Austin Barber, not bad, but not great. Same thing for Egokin. Same thing for a lot of these other guys. So I think when you look overall at the team, there are a lot of guys who are kind of average. And it
Sounds
turns
like
out
you're
that,
describing a 500 roster, Will.
well, it seems like that might be what it is. I'm not sure we're going to finish at 500. Gonna have to pull an upset off there. But yeah, that's exactly what I'm describing. Is that the roster itself? And I'm not sure I appreciated this coming into the season, but the roster itself, we sort of penciled in Jason Marshall to take a step forward. Kind of penciled in a guy like Austin Barber to be a really good left tackle because he was pretty good last year, right? Penciled in ETN to make a jump from a freshman all SEC to all SEC. And to be honest, the only guys who have a shot to make all SEC are Ricky Pearsall and Trey Wilson. And it's funny because all offseason we would have talked about wide receivers being one of the weak positions on Florida's offense, and it turns out that's where all the all SEC play is coming from, and it's not coming from anywhere else. Look, it takes anywhere between 6 and 9 all SEC players to win the SEC championship. But if you go back and look at like Dan Mullen's teams in 2018, 2019, those teams had 3 to 4 all SEC players. So if you want to win 9, 10, 11 games, you're going to need 4 all SEC players. And that's what's happening with Florida is they've got 2 maybe. I think Trey Wilson might not make it this year. He'll make the freshman team, but he might not make all SEC. 1, because he's a freshman and they'll make him wait. But 2, he's getting a lot of those the little shovel passes that are padding his stats a little bit. So he's only averaging like 8 or 9 yards an attempt or a catch. And so I do suspect that there might be that he may not make it. So Florida probably ends up with 1 all SEC player this year. And when you go look at teams that have 1 all SEC player, they tend to be teams that went 3 and 6 in conference or 3 and 5 in conference, and teams that had 500 records and teams that struggled at different times. Because the better teams end up getting those guys on the teams, and that's just sort of where Florida is right now.
Give us hope for not giving up 100 points combined over the next 2 games.
I guess the hope would be that Florida State is somebody that this team's going to get up for against guys that they've all played against.
So you just skipped right to Florida State. Missouri,
Well,
we're giving up 50 to Missouri.
well, I mean, it's in Columbia, which hasn't gone real well for Florida.
Yeah.
It's going to be cold. At some point they're either going to get a chip on their shoulder and rally around Napier, or things are going to start to sort of fall apart. And I haven't felt like things have fallen apart. The effort at times on certain plays has looked suspect, but the effort overall for the team has not looked suspect. In terms of like they've battled like the South Carolina game a couple of years ago, that was sort of the beginning and the end for Dan Mullen. Right afterwards, you had Hevesy and Grantham get fired. That was something where the team just looked flat, looked uninspired, and didn't look like they wanted to be there. That has not happened yet. And so as long as that doesn't happen, I think they have a shot in both of these, but it's going to take a lot, right? LSU tried to give them that game in a lot of different ways. Like if they'd have just run a read option on 3rd or 4th down on the drive where they got stuffed at the 1, I think Jaden Daniels walks in, completely unscathed. I think they didn't want to do it because he was coming off a concussion, and they didn't necessarily want to run that play. They ran 1 read option that I could see the entire game. And so they didn't necessarily want to run that play, and Florida kind of got off the hook because of that. Then they give them the kickoff and fumble that one back over, and that gives Florida a free 7 points and allows Florida to sort of get back into it, even after they'd given up that touchdown after they'd had a 3 and out to start the half. They're not going to be able to do that. Florida's going to have to play a perfect game. And then the defense, Missouri and Florida State, Missouri specifically, is not some dynamic offense, but they're not awful. And so that's going to be the question. The question is going to be, is the 11.5 yards per attempt that Florida gave up against LSU an aberration because LSU is just that good? Or does Florida make every offense better than it already is, which is what the answer has been all year, which is why, 50 points is an exaggeration, but I think Florida's going to need 42 to win one of these next 2 games. And that's just sort of the reality.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough sledding on the defensive front right now, but you are seeing a lot of young guys get some playing time. That's about the only positive I can pull out of that at the moment. Also you got a 1st-year coordinator. who's learning on the job a little bit. I think Austin Armstrong has an amazing pedigree. I understand why he's in the position he is at the moment. But you'd like to see some adjustments made here in the next two games to give us a shot on the defense side of the ball, especially when the offense seems to actually be clicking here down the stretch. Will, you got 311 yards out of Graham Mertz and a touchdown. You saw a combined on the ground. We had a combined 34 touches for ETN and Montrell Johnson. Johnson had another 6 catches too for 65 yards here. So a lot of touches for Johnson, ETN, and the offense was cooking. In addition, you had another another 13 touches for Pearsall and Wilson. That's what you want to see pretty much game to game out of this offense. You really couldn't do much more to get it done. I know you talked about the tough call with Khalil Jackson on that deep ball that was on the third down play where they initially called it a catch and then they overruled it. But it's not the explosive offense that you see like out of an LSU, where LSU has a truly elite offense, but it's just been a steady offense that can march down the field, sustain long drives, and put you in position to score fairly consistently in most games this year. There's been a steadier offense than we saw last year, in my opinion. That's the interesting thing I'm pulling out of the LSU game here is if you go game to game, consistency wise, I think it's been a steadier offensive effort across the board. It's not the best offense we've ever seen at Florida, but it's much better than some of the offenses you saw in other seasons where Florida has struggled in recent memory.
Yeah, I don't know about that necessarily. I think Anthony Richardson was effective at times. His legs certainly brought something to the forefront. And if you look at the rushing yards, if you put quarterback rushing yards into Florida's rushing total for this year already, all of a sudden you're starting to see an offense that's rushing very similarly. Richardson averaged 6.5 yards per rush. Mertz is averaging just over 8 yards per throw. And so the comparison there, I think what it really boils down to is Florida's offense last year was much less consistent and much more explosive.
Mm-hmm.
This year, it's much more consistent and much less explosive. And I don't know whether that combination is any better. Now, I think overall this year, so Florida is 22nd overall in 10 plus yard plays. So they got 162. Then they're 56th in 20 plus yard plays, 105th in 30 plus yard plays, and 106th in 40 plus yard plays. So really what it boils down to is they get a lot of 12-yard gains. They get a lot of 22-yard gains. They don't get a lot of 50-yard gains. They don't take the ball to the house very often at all. And, there are offenses that are like that. That's fine. But the fact that their defense is what their defense is a problem, right? So if you look at this game against LSU, they had a 24-yard pass to Hayden Hansen, a 33-yard pass to Ricky Pearsall, 21-yard run for ETN, a 20-yard pass to Marcus Burke, and then a 24-yard pass to Wilson. If you look at LSU, 38-yard pass to Neighbors, 41-yard pass to Thomas, 38-yard run by Daniels, 85-yard run by Daniels, 27-yard run for Daniels, 45-yard pass to Williams, 51-yard run for Daniels, 52-yard pass to Williams, 44-yard pass to Neighbors, 37-yard pass to Thomas. So not only was 1/6 of their plays, so 10 explosives in 61 plays. Not only was a sixth of it explosive, but they averaged 46 yards per explosive, which means they converted every explosive into a score. So every one of those that I named off there either led to a touchdown or a field goal. And sometimes there were 2-on-1 drive. If you look at Florida, the first one, they had a fumble. The last one they turned over on downs, and then two of them came on the same drive. So they took 5 explosives and turned that into 2 touchdowns, whereas LSU took 10 explosives and turned that into probably 35 or 40 points. And that to me is the difference, is when you roll off a 20-yard run, it puts you in position for a field goal. When you put off a 50-yard run, oftentimes that's a touchdown. You've gone the whole way. And even if you didn't, it's put you deep in the red zone. You got the defense on its heels, those sorts of things. That's the stuff that Florida's offense just can't do this year. Again, I think they're limited. I think they're limited at the quarterback position. We've sort of seen that all year. Again, I think Graham Mertz has come back to earth a little bit over the past few weeks. He's now down to 73% completions. He was up over 80% after the Vanderbilt game. So he's 62, 73, 61, 68 over the last 4 games. Not bad. but he's also 8.8 yards per attempt, 6.8, 6.7, 8.2. Now he's got 6 touchdowns and 0 interceptions, but his yards per completion is still just 11. QE rating the last 4, 157, 149, 142, and 146. That's just barely above average, and he doesn't bring anything in the running game at all. So, in those 4 games, he's 6 for -7, 5 for -32, 4 for -3, and 7 for 7. So my yards above replacement has him for the season at -0.28, so a little bit below average. Had him in the LSU game at 0.13, just slightly above average. And, that's the thing, is that yards above replacement is an efficiency stat. Mertz has not been that efficient. What he has been is very consistent. And, I tend to think that the efficiency is more important, and I think that sort of shows up over the course of a game and over the course of a season.
So when you look at your preseason expectations for Mertz, would you say that I personally, my feel on this is that as much as we've struggled in some of these big games, right? I thought there was a definitive ceiling on what Mertz could be coming in as a starter. I think that Napier has gotten really the high end of what you can hope for out of Mertz based on his career profile at Wisconsin, right? And like I know there's a lot of people that I think have been tough on Mertz. I think I'm going off a lot of what I saw at Wisconsin with him. I think he's played pretty well in a Gator uniform compared to what we saw in Madison. That's what I it's the high end of what you could have hoped for when Mertz transferred in.
So I wrote an article in March that sort of lined out what I thought his floor and his ceiling would be. And really his ceiling was 25 touchdowns, 5 picks, and his ceiling quarterback rating I had at 154.7, and right now for the season he's 157.5, and I had his ceiling for yards above replacement at -0.21. He's at -0.28, so he really has hit exactly what I expected that ceiling to be. And kudos to Mertz and kudos to Napier for getting that out of him and being able to hit his ceiling. The problem is I don't think that ceiling is great, right? It's average. He is an average quarterback. A QB rating of 157 is above average, but when you factor in all the just nothing that he brings in the running game, I think that impacts him negatively in terms of overall the value that he brings. And if he threw a bunch of the balls away and didn't take sacks, there was a play against I was a little bit late getting home for the game against Arkansas, and somebody texted me, Mertz seems unable to throw the ball away. And I knew exactly what play he was talking about when I was rewatching the game, because there was a play where he ran out of bounds 3 yards behind the line of scrimmage on a 1st and 10.
Mhm.
And he didn't need to run out of bounds. He could have just tossed it 3 yards ahead, and it would have been an incompletion, wouldn't have been a sack, wouldn't have lost 3 yards. And he lost 3 yards there. Now, that's not every running play that he's had. And Florida's offensive line has problems as well, which has made things even worse. But if you looked at Mertz at Wisconsin, one of his weaknesses was that he took a lot of sacks and a lot of negative plays in the running game. And this year, that has not changed. His throwing, I think, has been much better. He's been much more consistent, and he's been able to really not turn the ball over, which has been one of the biggest things. 17 touchdowns,
Which
2
is a
interceptions.
sign of growth, by the way.
Sure.
This is someone unlike the rest of the roster where we're talking about the youth movement here. This is a guy you're seeing him maybe grow from his experiences. Maybe the next step here is figuring out, hey, let's give up on this play. Let's throw that ball away. That's
So
the next
so
step in the evolution. If
so
because it's a high likelihood at this point. I think what we've seen 10 games. That's enough of a resume this season where I think, is it a fairly safe bet that we're going to see him as the starter next year to come out the gate?
So I think so. I think
Yeah.
so there are a couple of things that I want to make sure that I at least caution people on. One is that Missouri and FSU have 2 of the better defenses that Mertz will have faced all year. And so it's entirely possible that his statistical profile looks considerably worse
Right.
after the next 2 games. We'll see, right? I think 10 games is a pretty decent sample size, and I expect him to play at about the level he has. I think this is probably he has taken a step up. The other thing, though, that I would say, and I would caution people, is very, very rarely do you see someone take big steps 2 years in a row. In fact, you
Mhm.
almost never see quarterbacks take 2 steps overall. You'll see a guy like Burrow go from average to great. You'll see a guy go from bad to average. You'll see a guy go from average to good. Um, see that jump, and there is a jump that is real. You can usually see that with quarterbacks who have multiple years behind center. But and especially now that we've got guys changing schemes where a scheme may fit somebody better. And certainly there was a lot of talk before the season that more shotgun, not being under center, being able to have more control over the offense, not just running into the line and setting up a bunch of 3rd and 12s would be a positive thing for Mertz. I think all that stuff has been true. At the same time, it's very rare to see someone take 2 straight leaps. The leap that Daniels has taken this year is actually very surprising to me, given he took a pretty decent leap last year coming from Arizona State. At the same time, a lot of the stuff that he's done this year, and he's been much better this year, but a lot of the stuff that he's doing this year is sort of building on last year. But that's rare. It's really rare to see 2 big leaps in a row. So I don't think we should expect it. I think we should expect that whatever we get out of Mertz this year, for when you look at his total body of work, it's probably very similar to what we'll get next year. And that's not bad. It's just bad when you have a defense that can't stop anybody. So overall, where does Florida need to improve if they're going to have Mertz come back a quarterback next year? Has nothing to do with Mertz taking another leap. Because even if they had the number 1 offense in the country, they'd be LSU. We'd be sitting here at 7-3, ticked off about losing a game to Georgia that we never should have lost but couldn't stop them, and ticked off at probably losing the game to some other team that we just couldn't stop, couldn't get off the field. And we're sitting there 7-3 going, oh God, if we could stop someone, we might win a title. And it turns out Florida has a recent experience with that back in 2020. So we know exactly how the LSU folks feel right now. And, it's just, this offense is not at that level, which means the defense is going to have to pull more of its weight. And as of right now, it's not doing that, obviously.
Well, I know Billy's taking a lot of bullets right now. He's taking a lot of heat. And so I think you got to be fair and point out what he's doing well. And I think, Wisconsin fans watching Graham Mertz this year is probably like, who's this guy? So I definitely think he's gotten the high end of what he's capable of, and Mertz is performing at the high end of what he's capable of as well. And that's not a shot at Mertz. I promise that's a compliment. And that's something that I do think that you got just looking for some positive aspects here. So by all means, shred the fact that we gave up 700 yards. Well, like we should shred that fact. And I'll say this. I love Billy Napier's demeanor in general. I think as a leader, he's somebody that you're proud to have as the face of the program. I can say I always personally liked Dan Mullen. I kind of like, I think he had a sense of humor, a little bit of a goofy sense of humor at times. He had fun at times, but he also could put his foot at times and quite frankly just looked like an ass at times, right? McElwain never got it from day one. Didn't totally understand it. Never really connected with it. Wasn't a guy that you're like, oh, that's our guy right there. I never felt that way from day one with McElwain. Never really connected for me. But I will say, so when I say the face of the program and that Billy is like that type of guy that you want out there representing your school as the football coach, I really do believe in him in that aspect, that CEO type aspect. I would love for him to come out. And I know he's the players' coach, and I know he's a friendly guy with the players, and that the players seem to love him. But man, you give up 700 yards. Like, I don't need to hear that lunch was successful. Like, we had a successful lunch today. Like, we were really trying to get the right recipe down. We got it down. Let's not forget the fact that we also tied our shoes correctly. And like, we don't need to list everything we did. Like, we could talk about the game. Like, there's things you say inside the locker room, and there's things you say to the fans. And right now at the University of Florida, we're not used to giving up 52. We're not used to giving up 700 yards. How many years are we about on 115 years of football? We've never given up 700 yards before. Maybe a little bit of fire about that. Like, I know they were in the game in the fourth quarter, but did they rise to the challenge? Not like there's times in the press conferences where there's got to be a little more acknowledgement of what's going on the field. I keep joking that I want to slap a White House logo behind some of these press conferences, because it's like, I don't need to you don't need to piss on my leg, tell me it's raining, like I just like there's times where you just got to call it for what it is. And I think like Florida, two of the Florida greats, Steve Spurrier and Urban Meyer, I went back and I looked up some old Urban press conferences after a loss, and after the 2010 loss to Alabama, this was like the Monday presser, I believe. He in there. His opening statement, the first words out of his mouth were "We failed miserably," and it's like you don't have to go come down on specific players. You don't have to, if you don't want to do specific call outs, that's not your style. That's fine. But you'd like to see a little more juice in those situations to at least call out the fact that we understand that 700 yards isn't acceptable. And I know he gets that. Like, I'm not doubting that he gets that. But I think if you're reevaluating processes in the offseason, I think something is just be a little more real with the fans on that. It's your chance to communicate to your players from behind the podium. It's also your chance to communicate to the fans and the media and everybody else. So I would love to see a little more intensity when you get your butts beat, giving up 700 yards and putting a guy in a bronze trophy forever. That's personal opinion from the last few press conferences that I'd like to put out there.
Well, I mean, he's not making any friends by after the Arkansas game. He basically said, other than the missed PAT and the missed field goal, special teams was much better this week. And you're like, yeah, I don't want to hear that. I want like, and neither do the fans, right? The fans sit there and look and go, yeah, but everybody else can execute a PAT and everybody else can figure out what to do coming out of a timeout when they get in position for a field goal. And so the fact that we don't know how to do that is a problem. And I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that that's a problem, that 130 other FBS teams can do that sort of stuff. And if Florida can't do that, that there's an actual problem. It's not the way Napier operates. Hasn't been the way he's operated since he's gotten here. And so to expect him to be somebody different is, I think, an unfair expectation. But it does add to it adds to the consternation when you don't feel like the coach is flogging himself, right? No one ever doubted that Urban Meyer, when Florida was losing, cared more about losing than any of the fans did.
Right.
I mean, the guy damn near killed himself because he cared about winning so much. And he's sitting there like texting recruits right after winning the national championship. Now he looks back on that and says that was a sickness, right? Like I was out of control. But I look at it and go, that's why you won 2 national championships, is because you had that level of intensity. And, you know, I read a couple years ago a book by Seth Wickersham that was a biography of Kraft, Brady, and Belichick. And one of the things I came out of that thinking was it worth it? Like Belichick had like just burned all these relationships that he had to the ground in furtherance of trying to win. And it was very clear that that was his drive. And you think about the way Brady and Belichick ended there in New England, as opposed to riding off into the sunset together. Brady leaves to try to prove that it wasn't just Belichick. And now Belichick's holding on for dear life, trying to prove it wasn't just Brady. And, you know, those guys are ultra competitive and want to be able to prove that they were a big part of what happened. And I think we all recognize that they were a big part of it. But that fire is the thing that sort of defines them. And look, I think there are people who are wired like that and people who aren't. And Billy Napier doesn't seem to be wired like that. So to expect him to be this rah-rah guy who's going to go out there and do that, I think is a bad expectation. What I would say though is that there should be an expectation of reality, that you shouldn't sit there and go, well, special teams is fine except for those 2 screw ups that nobody else has.
That's what I'm
when
talking about. You don't have to be the Urban Meyer intensity. Like, and by the way, I think Billy Napier is plenty intense about different things. I think he purposefully has that demeanor toward facing the media, and I can understand keeping it cool. I can understand all those things, and I'm not asking him to be a different person, but it's the phrase you use, just acknowledge reality. You can say in a calm manner, we're not going to get a super animated Billy, like, but you can say in a calm manner that, like, yeah, that's an unacceptable performance on the defensive side of the ball, right? Like, we know that doesn't meet our standards around here.
Well, so let me. So that has been a pattern throughout the season. So when they had when they had the 2 number 3s on the field against Utah,
Right.
the comment was, well, this was a situation we haven't been in before, blah, 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 blah. Right. When they had a guy run out late for a PAT against Arkansas, for a field goal attempt against Arkansas, it was, well, we had a guy injured and there was a miscommunication on the sideline, those sorts of things. Right. He just sort of there are Urban Meyer would not allow that miscommunication to happen, because the person who miscommunicated probably wouldn't would like rue the day that he miscommunicated, right? Like there was a fear associated with that sort of stuff. And not every coach rules by fear, but the lack of accountability at the lectern for the things that are going on, I think does disturb some fans. Like fans want to believe that Napier is down in the trenches with them, not above them and saying, well, I can figure this out. It's like, we can look, we don't believe you. I think that's the big problem. I said this after the Utah game when he was like, everything was clean in practice this week. We made some mistakes that are uncharacteristic. Everything was clean in practice. Like, I don't believe you because you couldn't line up right twice. And if you can't get into a legal formation, you can't convince me that everything was clean during practice, or it means you weren't practicing the things that you then tried to execute in the game on Saturday, because the crowd should have nothing to do with you actually lining up properly. And that's, so that's the issue, is that you got people feeling like he's not telling them the truth, as opposed to,
Right.
as opposed to just him having a more mellow demeanor. So yeah, tell the truth, tell it like it is, and move forward. He would be well served to do that. I'm just not sure he's going to.
It's okay to be process oriented and not get emotional and not where I'm not. I know you're not going to get an Urban Meyer replica behind the lectern. And you're definitely, Steve Spurrier is about one of a kind. You're never going to get a Spurrier again. I mean, there's very few people that can even come close to what Spurrier was behind a mic. But I'm okay with the fact, I want him to put his own stamp on things, but just, it's like you said, just tell us if something's not good in a non-emotional, process oriented way. You can communicate that wasn't good, and that's the only thing that I've seen the last few weeks. I go, let's get that one together a little bit, because it's tough to listen to, and I think it's going to rub people the wrong way. I think the supporters of the program is going to rub them the wrong way, I feel like, and you just want to hear that, that's not it. Like, hey, we got young guys out there. And I think if you do listen to it through, and I'm picking some things within their own context. There's bigger context to these things, obviously. If you listen to it through, he does stress that the team's young. I think he tries to explain, but I almost think he tries to explain to the outside world like you would to the inside world a little bit. And you try to communicate it in like, well, we're working on getting better. Like, okay, like we know, but you can also talk about that. There's a different way you can talk to the outside world than you do the inside world. And
well, you can say what. So there's a great scene in the movie Bull Durham where Crash Davis, for some of you younger people, you may not have seen this, but Crash Davis, the catcher, walks over to Tim Robbins' character, Nuke Lelouch, and shows him his shower shoes, and they got a bunch of fungus on it, and they're in the minor leagues, and he's like, these are filthy, clean them up. He's like, why? He's like, once you get to the majors, you can have whatever you want to grow on those shower shoes, and the press will think you're colorful. Right now, it just means you're a slob. And that's what I think of in terms of what you're saying, is Billy Napier can say whatever he wants if Florida's 9-3, right? Because the expectations for this year were 7-5, 6-6, something like that. But you're 5-5, about to end the season on a 5-game losing streak and end up 5-7. Miss a bowl game, miss those important practices for all these young guys that you're talking about. And so right now, you're a slob because the shower shoes have fungus on them. And you haven't made it to the show yet. So if Steve Spurrier had been as brash as he was and had gone 6-6, he wouldn't be beloved. He's beloved because he won SEC championships and national championships, and the winning made the brashness drive the rivals nuts. And that was part of the fun for that entire thing. Now, today, we might actually have a different opinion, because if you go look at his success against Bobby Bowden, he actually struggled quite a bit against Florida State, has a losing record against Bowden and Florida State. In today's world, that might have been an area for criticism. And when he was brash in those particular games, especially when you think about like the choke at Doak and those sorts of things, maybe it would have, just in today's media environment, it would have been a little bit different. But Spurrier got to be brash because he won. Like, and that's the deal. You win national championships, you can say whatever you want. You win SEC championships, you can say whatever you want. And this was Dan Mullen's issue, is he was winning January, big time bowl games, but not playoff games. And the expectation of Florida's playoff games. So you can't stick your foot in your mouth about recruiting when you're winning Peach Bowls. You got to go win playoff games, and then you can talk about it being recruiting season and those sorts of things. Same thing for Muschamp, same thing for McElwain, is those, we'll get it fixed, we'll get it fixed, rings hollow after a while. You actually need to show progress over time. And that's the deal, right? Is that Billy Napier when, I've been saying this now for months, is he's going to go as far as DJ Lagway carries him. And if DJ Lagway comes in as an outstanding player at the quarterback position, Florida's going to start to win a bunch of games. And when they win a bunch of games, then Billy Napier will be able to say whatever he wants during press conferences. And we'll be seen as negative people if we pick out things from his press conferences and sort of focus in on them, and go, well, what did he really mean here? And that sort of stuff. The problem is it's the same story week after week after week after week. Florida can't stop anybody. They make issues. They have issues on special teams. There's at least one or two just mechanical or game management flubs in every game. And that's what we see, rinse, repeat every single game. And it's been that way since 2022 because it was that way last year. It's been that way this year. And so if all you're getting is the same thing over and over, the only thing you have left is to pick apart the press conference, which is sort of what you're doing. Again, I think people love Napier if he's 10-2 and Lagway's chucking the ball all over the place. But if Mertz comes out there and plays like he did last year and the defense is just as bad next year, well, people won't love those press conferences because Florida's going to be losing games. That's just the reality.
I don't think it needs to happen every time you lose. I think there are certain instances, though, where you can convey a little bit to the fans. It's just, it comes across, it's like you said, it just comes across as not genuine at times, where I do think one of his strengths is he is very genuine. It seems like across the board when you're talking about, the 5 things you did well after when you got smoked on defense. It's like, okay, all right. Like I get it, but
hey, they didn't give up any third down conversions in the second half. LSU was 0 for 1 in the second half on third downs.
Florida, LSU 2 for 6 on the night, third down. Florida's just dominant on that third down defense. 2 for 6 for LSU. Of course, you have to have a third down once in a while to hold them, but hey, overall,
we won time up. You wrote me earlier. We won time of possession by 10 minutes, man. You got to look on the bright side.
Hey, man, Dan Mullen cited the stat sheet. Why can't we do it now? Hey, overall, I do believe in what Napier's building overall, and I think if you go back and look at our magazine, we had this season pegged pretty decently in terms of the fact that this is going to be a growing year. We've certainly seen that. We've seen a little bit of the roller coaster ride. We've almost seen the offense and defense flip roles from the beginning of the season to now. It's been an interesting 10 games. And hopefully you got 2 more shots to pull off the upset to get bowl eligible. Man, I'd love to do it against FSU, but beating Eli and Missouri would also be interesting, Will.
Cashed in a lot of chips in that Arkansas game, and so need to get a few of them back in one of these last 2, that's for sure.
Missouri coming into the game 8-2. 2 losses, 10-point loss to LSU, in which they were up in that game deep into the second half. Very competitive game at Georgia. This is definitely Eli Drinkwitz's best team. Speaking of being brash without not much results behind your name, Eli Drinkwitz will. Mizzou, if they win this game, this is going to be win number 9. They've only won 9 or more in a season 8 times in 122 seasons of football. So it's pretty significant what's going on in Columbia this season. Brady Cook taking a big step this season, throwing for over 2,700 yards to this point, 17 TDs. And Cody Schrader, the running back, played for Division II Truman State from 2018 to 2021 before walking on Mizzou last season. 6 games of 100 yards or more on the ground, including the last 3. Went off for 205 yards and 1 touchdown against Tennessee last week. Over 1,100 yards, 11 touchdowns on the season. And of course, that wide receiver room's pretty solid, but over half the production, 111 out of the 205 receptions on the season, going to Luther Burden and Theo Weiss. So 2 big-time receivers, that running back Schrader and Cook. The offense has been very solid for Missouri this year. Overall, only 2 opponents have held Mizzou under 30, one of them being the mighty Blue Raiders out of Middle Tennessee State, and the other one being the Georgia Bulldogs. So this is a tough Missouri offense. As a Gator fan coming off of this LSU game, the one thing you could say is maybe the Heisman contention, maybe there'll be another contender next to Jaden Daniels after this game here. Well, Mizzou's offense looking pretty solid this season so far.
I mean, you sort of hope Florida takes that personally, right? That Jaden Daniels came out and just ran them over, and that they come out ready to go in this game against Missouri. Like at some point, when are you going to get a chip on your shoulder and go out there and actually prove that you're better than what you've shown on the field so far? So Missouri, very, very good team. What I would say is if you look at points for and points against, there's not as big a differential as you'd think. So 32.6 points for, 23.7 against. Those are FBS teams. So over a 10-game schedule, you'd expect them to be 6.5 and 3.5. So 6-4, 7-4, 6 and no, I'm sorry, 7-3 or 6-4.
Cut. Just start it over. I'll cut it up.
All right, 3, 2, 1, go. From a scoring potential, perspective, they're not really that differentiated from Florida. So 32.6 points per game against FBS opponents, 23.7 against. That's a 65% winning percentage. So 6.5 and 3.5 is sort of what you'd expect their winning percentage to be. So either 6-4 or 7-3. Still a good team, but they're at 8-2, right? So they've gotten a little bit lucky over the course of the year. Now, Florida, if you do the same analysis, they've actually been outscored against FBS opponents, 27.3 to 29.7. That's a record of 4.6 to 5.4. So 5-5 is really right for Florida over a 5-game span when you look at their scoring differential. But you think about Missouri could kind of be a 6-win team. Florida could be a 5-win team. This could very easily be a 6-4 versus 5-5 matchup as opposed to an 8-2. So that's the first thing I'd sort of take from it is these teams are not massively apart. If you looked at a team like Georgia and its scoring differential, you'd be looking at a team that's predicted to be 9-1. And Georgia obviously is differentiated from that. And actually LSU's scoring differential gives them a better record than Missouri just because their offense is so good. But look, when you look at every statistic across the board, whether it's points per game, yards per play, yards per rush, yards per pass on offense and defense, Missouri's better in every single category. And so then if you even go to like explosive plays, Missouri, 10 plus yard plays, I told you 162 for Florida, ranks 22nd. Missouri also 22nd. They've given up 162, but then they've got 59 20 plus yard plays. So they're ranked 13th, 18th in 30 plus yard plays, and 28th in 40 plus yard plays. They've had 14 20 plus yard plays compared to 7 for Florida. So Missouri is able to hit a big play when the big play presents itself in a way that Florida is not able to. And on the defensive side of the ball, they're sort of worst case scenario for Florida. 10 plus, they're 95th, then 80th and 20 plus, 36th and 30 plus, and 3 and 3rd and 40 plus. So they're not giving up those big plays that Florida kind of needs and you would like to see Florida get over the course of the game. So everything, and then I guess the last part is if you go to quarterback, Brady Cook has a QB rating of 160.7, which isn't much higher than Graham Mertz's 157.5, but he averages 0.6 yards per attempt more, so 9.5 to 8.9. And he's not a nothing on the ground. So 81 rushes for 228 yards. So I have his yards above replacement at 1.28. Mertz is at negative 0.26. So Florida has a disadvantage at the quarterback position, a disadvantage at defense, a disadvantage on the offensive line. If you start looking at the statistics in terms of sacks, there are way more. So sacks per game, Missouri ranks 19th. Florida's 96th. Tackles for loss, Missouri's 58th. Florida's 107th. Sacks per game allowed, Missouri's 57th. Florida's 115th. Tackles per loss allowed, 76th for Missouri, 95th for Florida. So in every category that I can find that I think actually portends what's going to happen on the field, Missouri is significantly ahead of Florida. And so it's going to take turnovers. It's going to take maybe even an injury, and I hope nobody gets injured, but it might take something like that. It's going to take somebody stepping up and getting, stepping in front, high pointing a ball on a deep throw where they're actually able to stay in phase. It's going to take Burden maybe fumbling the ball on one of those little screens they give him where you put a helmet right on the ball, you fumble it, and you take it the other way. Florida's probably going to need a defensive score in this one in order to win it. Otherwise, I think you're just looking at covering best case scenario because Missouri's clearly the better team.
Yeah. It's and what's the spread right now?
I think it's 11.5.
11.5. Yeah, I hadn't checked it yet. Man, that's it's tough matchup. It's tough matchup this week, especially when you consider their offensive firepower. You mentioned as well too, Will. The defense is just it's been pretty solid for these Tigers. The defense I think for them has been more the strength the last couple of years, but they're really kind of putting it all together this year and having a good run. Only 2 opponents have topped the 30-point mark. You had Georgia score 30 on them, and LSU, of course, had the 49-39 win over them around about a month ago at this point. So not giving up huge numbers to the opponents, Will. We're seeing in recent weeks, even outside of that Georgia game, this defense has been pretty stingy.
Yeah, I mean, they're not great. So they're 45th in points per game allowed, 52nd in yards per play. That's average, maybe a little bit above average overall. Obviously, there's 133 teams in FBS. So if you're 52nd, the difference is that they're pretty consistent all across the board. The one place where they haven't been great is they're 70th in yards per rush. So 4.2 yards per rush. Now, Florida's 94th. So like I said, Florida's worst in every category. At the same time, this isn't an offense that's going to necessarily dominate, but they're 46th in yards per rush allowed. They're 49th in yards per pass allowed. So very balanced. This is not something where I look at it and go, oh, there's some glaring hole that Florida's going to be able to take advantage of. It's something where I look at it and I go, Florida's going to have to do some things they haven't done so far this year, and certainly haven't done in the last 4 or 5 games in order to get the victory here. And that's the thing, is you've got to bank on them doing something out of character in order to get the win. And I think that's one of the reasons why certainly Missouri is favored by as much as they are.
Yeah. Well, that's a quick preview of the Missouri game here this week. Let's talk about a couple of decommits. You saw Jamonta Waller jump to Auburn, big time flip there for the Auburn Tigers. Well, and later in the weekend, you saw Wardell Mack flip to Texas, a cornerback out of, I believe, New Orleans. He's flipping to Texas here. So I know that's been a concern over many fans have been concerned over this 2024 class, that if the results on the field started to trend down, how would it affect the 2024 class? I'm not panicking. Two guys, well, it's the NIL era. I think you're going to expect high level players to be the types of guys that flip here and there. So you're not going to see it a whole lot, but I do think that I'm not totally shocked that a couple of guys have flipped. Is it great that it came on the same weekend? Does that send a good message that's coming on the same weekend? No. Does it put more urgency on holding on to some other guys in the class? It absolutely does. And it's good that you're in these battles, though. I'll say that. So Florida's obviously been on the winning side of some of these battles on the recruiting trail. I think it's natural to see a couple guys flip here and there. So to me, this isn't raising too many red flags yet, but definitely something to keep an eye on.
Well, I mean, look, Waller's a good player, Mack's a good player. They're both top 150 in the
Mhm.
24/7 composite, both defensive players. And when you think about how much we've harped on the defense tonight, that makes a difference, right? That you're losing top 150 players on the defensive side of the ball. Waller had sort of a widespread, I think ESPN had him as like a top 10 or top 15 player. Certainly when you look at the tape, he seems like a guy who has a lot of potential to be a difference maker. And look, Florida doesn't have any difference makers right now on the defensive line. Nobody that you would look at and go, oh, there's a John Grenard. Nobody you look at and say there's a Ja'Kai Polite or somebody from that ilk. Certainly not a Javon Curse or anything like that. And so, the more shots you have at those guys, the better off you are. I think overall, from a class ranking perspective and those sorts of things, Florida's right where they were before this. I mean, they dropped from third to fourth in the overall points, but that's because they lost volume. It's not because they lost quality. It's not because their quality of player has gone down significantly. I think they went from 92.6 to 92.4 in the average player rating. Florida State's around like 91.6 or 91.7, but they have three more recruits. And so from a points perspective, they jumped in front of Florida. If Florida fills out this class with players in similar talent profiles as they have in the class thus far, and that tends to be how teams work. I mean, I've done some work on this in the past where essentially things level out in terms of average player rating once you get to this point in the season. In fact, Dan Mullen was one of the few people who saw a really significant uptick in this towards the end of right as early signing day comes in. Certainly the optics don't look great, especially with the defense struggling. You figure there's a lot of early playing time, and these guys aren't necessarily interested in that. But look, the Waller flip had been rumored for probably a month now, so it's not as the I mean, and at that point Florida's 5-1 or 5-2, so it's not as though it was this big losing streak that led Waller to flip. Waller flipped because Auburn and Hugh Freeze are an excellent recruiting apparatus, and Waller decided that was a better opportunity for him, or the NIL deal that he got was better, or they promised him stuff that Napier wouldn't, or he just felt more comfortable with the coaches, right? And so I don't blame Waller for trying to get the best deal he can for himself and the best situation that he can for himself. At the same time, that is going to be the key. Napier has to close on this class, because you can deal with 6-6 for a while if you've got big time recruits coming on the horizon. And the issue with Mullen was you could talk about 10-3, but that was all you were going to talk about because there weren't big time recruits on the horizon to take them to the next level. And he wasn't even able to get an elite quarterback recruit to come in, right? I mean, you could make an argument that Anthony Richardson was that guy, but he refused to play him. and so he had a guy who was a top 5 draft pick in the NFL and refused to play him over Emory Jones. And Emory Jones is an okay player, but we're seeing the same thing with him at Cincinnati. Is he's approximately the same player he was at Florida. He's just getting a lot more reps while he's out there at Cincinnati. So Mullen never brought in that guy. He certainly never brought in a 5-star can't miss prospect at the quarterback position, and suffered for it. So Napier's already got that guy in the fold. As long as Lagway stays in the fold, I think Florida has an opportunity to win a bunch of games downstream, so long as Lagway turns into the guy. And that'll be the thing, is that essentially at this point, Billy Napier's future is tied to DJ Lagway. That's a lot of pressure on Lagway, but that's just the reality, is that the quarterback position drives wins and losses, and he's got his elite quarterback coming in 2024. The question will be, does he have to put him into the fire early? Because look, if Lagway was last year's class, you could justify, like, at this point, that's what we'd be pointing to, right? So let's say Jaden Rashada had stuck and Mertz had won the job. I think at this point we'd be clamoring to see Rashada, because we'd be going, look, Mertz isn't the future of the program. You got to bring Rashada in. And if Rashada came in and played well for 2 or 3 straight games, and even if they lost these games, didn't make a bowl game, yada, 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 it wouldn't matter, because we would see the future of the program. And right now there is no future of the program sitting there at that position. There's the future of that program sitting there coming in 2024. And so that hope, which is the thing that everybody sort of points to, isn't here yet. We can't see that yet. We can't evaluate that. Once we get the opportunity to evaluate that, then we'll be able to evaluate this class. Because let's be honest, if you got a Baker Mayfield, or you got a Kyler Murray, or you got even a Jake Fromm, all of a sudden things look a lot better when you got a guy pulling the trigger who can put up 50 points of your own, right? And so what Lagway turns into is probably going to be a big determining factor in terms of what this program looks like over the next 3-4 years.
Yeah. And I do think we'll see Lagway at times next year. I do think he'll eventually get the job next year. Miami Hurricanes coming into town to open the season, August 31st, I believe. So that's another tough opener like we saw this year. That's why I think with Mertz, you're right though about the last 2 games. Let's see how the last 2 games go. But I think through 10 games, we got a pretty good idea of what he can be in Billy Napier's system here. So that'll be interesting to see going into 2024.
Well, here's what I'll tell people. I'm coming down for Thanksgiving, and my son Max, he's 8 years old. I took him to see Utah last year and they won. So he's fully confident that when I take him to see Florida State, Florida's going to win. So I told Dave on Gators Breakdown the other day, we're going to start a GoFundMe for Max to get him to that Miami game next year if they win against Florida State this year, because it's clear he's the good luck charm. And so Florida needs to come out with a chip on their shoulder against the Noles, if for no other reason, so they don't disappoint my son. That's the chip.
Got to make Max happy. But if Max gives up 50, we got to have some kind of there has to be accountability, okay?
Oh, don't worry.
We want to hear it from Billy. I want to hear accountability from Max if we give up 50 too, all right?
He's walking home at that point.
He's walking home. All right, good. So something's on the table. Good. I like that. Got to teach him. But all right, maybe he suffered enough if that happens too. We could give him a break. I don't know. We'll talk about it. But all right. Well, hey, tough week there after that LSU game. That defensive performance was pretty difficult to watch, but they were, if you want to take the bright side, they were in it. They're fighting. Like you said, we haven't seen a situation where this Gators team, they do fight. You got to give them credit there. They do fight. They don't roll over. It's just not completely where we want it to be right now. That's the simple way to put it. That's the simplest way to put it at the moment.
Like I said, you get a certain number of, like, when you got a bank account, you can take withdrawals, and you get down to where you got 0 in the account, and if you take another withdrawal, the check bounces. And we're sitting kind of on 0 here. The Arkansas was a big withdrawal when it comes to the goodwill with the fan base. And so it's on Napier, it's on this team to sort of build that back. And a 5-game losing streak and a 5-7 record is not going to taste good going into the offseason. It's going to be a long offseason because there's no bowl practices, there's no bowl game. You got early signing day with nothing else going on. And if there are flips, all of a sudden things start to get really hairy. And the narrative kind of gets out of your control if you're Billy Napier in that perspective, because there's nothing you can do to change it. And so to me, these last two games, and I said this after the Arkansas game, is I hoped they spent the last three games figuring out what their identity is. And I still don't know what the identity of the team is after watching that LSU game. And
Not
so
defense.
well, maybe
There
not,
you
but
go.
what I
Not
thought
special teams.
but what I thought they did in the second half is I thought that they started running power run. They started doing much more gap type blocking as opposed to zone blocking. They decided to do power runs, and Etienne and Montreal Johnson were really effective there.
Montreal was running hard
Yep.
the other night. I mean, they both were. They both always do, but it looked like a little extra pop out of Montreal.
They also tackled him like 20 yards out of bounds on that one play. So
Yeah, they almost ran him into the stands. No flag.
No
Don't
flag.
understand why, but
I do. They were in Baton Rouge. So
yeah.
But no, so this is the opportunity, right? This is the opportunity to put in a deposit. And Napier has two more shots, and either one of these games, and the fan base can breathe, right? The fan base can breathe, because you look at it, you go, we didn't expect to get one of these games, but we got it. You made up for, quote unquote, the Arkansas loss. You get the bowl games. Lagway can come in and get some of those bowl practices. All of a sudden now, what I talked about in the last two games, where if you had a guy who was the backup quarterback who might be the future, you'd be sort of clamoring for him. Well, during bowl practices, you can start to hear stuff about Lagway throwing to Trey Wilson, and all the lies we tell ourselves during spring and fall practice, we start telling during bowl practices. So there's a lot of good that can come out of getting that sixth win. And so, we'll see. Got two weeks left, and let's get one for Max.
And do it for Max. Why not Max? We'll just leave it there. You don't have to do the Max Brown anymore. All right. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Stand Up and Holler. For Will Miles, I'm Nick Knudsen. Have a great weekend, everybody, and go Gators.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to Stand Up and Holler. If you're interested in more information from me and Nick, you can go over to readandreaction.com. You can like and subscribe our YouTube channel here at Read and Reaction, or you can go to patreon.com/readandreaction to support us, get extra information, and we do Ask Anythings over there every once in a while as well. So check us out. Thanks for listening.